In this episode, I'm building a new Outfeed table. It's slightly larger than my old one and has storage for a whole bunch of jigs, which is fantastic because they're no longer all over the workshop. Before I get started, I do want to talk a little bit about the design. I've modelled this up in Fusion. I'll happily give away the model, see the description below for that for free. It's nothing overly exciting, and I don't think it's going to be overly helpful for a lot of people because it's 3/4 modelled and I'm using some of the scraps that I've got laying around the workshop. However, I do want to talk about the cut list program I use, which is Max Cut Community Edition. It's free, Windows only, but I'm sure it'll run under Wine or Boot Camp or whatever on other hardware, other operating systems. I don't use any sort of automation to take the dimensions from Fusion into Max Cut. There are options like CSV BOM is an add-in. I haven't found it particularly useful in my circumstances. I find entering in the data doesn't take all that long, and I can fine tune things such as the grain direction. I care more about how difficult it's going to be for me to cut. It's a workshop project, grain direction doesn't matter, but it is something that I can change in this program. And then when it comes to actually building the cut lists, the optimization settings in Max Cut are pretty great. I can choose to make sure that the first cut is either along the piece of wood or across it. So I can really optimize for, my back, for the person who's actually cutting it. And little changes like that can make a huge difference in either how easy it is to build or even how many sheets it'll take if you do care about grain direction. Then when I'm done with picking my layouts that actually work, I can export the reports from Max Cut Community Edition. Then I can load that into the vector editing software I use, which is Affinity Designer. And I color code all the like pieces. I just find printing that out makes a big difference for being able to visually group what cuts are the same. Yes, A, B, C, D does help, but having the colors makes it a really foolproof, and I'm quite the foolproof method of getting it to work. For the top, I'll be using some form ply. If you don't know what form ply is, it is some plywood that's used in concrete form construction. So it has a phenolic resin coating on it. So it's very resistant to liquids and unfortunately for markers. So I find the best way to mark out for my layout is to just use some blue tape and draw on the tape itself, because using even a white marker on the form ply is not great. It doesn't really adhere to it. Looking at my cut list, I can see that it's basically divided into 3 main sections that I need to rip down with the track saw or circular saw, whatever first. Then I can take it to the table saw and actually get it into final dimensions. So really these 3 large chunks, once I break them down, I can move a lot further in the workshop. So the first step is marking out each of these sections just in a simple ABC marker. Then I know when I come back to the table saw what I'm actually ripping off. It's not super relevant for this project, but it's always good practice to cut all the same size pieces or same width pieces at the same time without adjusting the fence. It's better to measure once and cut 50 things rather than it is to measure every single time. So I'll be bouncing between sheets A, B and C. First I'll be cutting all the pieces that are 75mm wide, then 57, then the remaining pieces from that. So for example, the stretches are all 75mm wide and the wider sections of the L legs are 75mm. So I'll cut those, then move on to all the other bits and pieces. The idea of locking the table saw fence in at one position for all the parts of the same size is great until I get to parts A and B, which have quite a large shelf on them. I should have cut the shelf off first so that they're more manageable and safer to cut on the table saw for the rest of the pieces. So to do that, I could run it through the table saw and move the fence, but what I'm going to do is just use my track saw, break off the 2 shelf pieces, and then they'll be about 1/4 of a sheet, which is really easy to put through the table saw. So a dado isn't needed. However, on the legs, it does make things a lot easier. Obviously, you could do this with a router table or a freehand router with an edge guide, but the table saw is the easiest way, particularly with a dado stack. The leg pieces will nest together to form a L shape or a corner shape. The wider section will get a very shallow dado. We're talking about 2-3 millimeters to receive the narrower piece. It stops everything from twisting, from being difficult to locate. I know where to drill for screws or for nails or to apply glue, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But it's just a slight upgrade from a butt joint, not so much in strength, but in terms of ease of getting a good joint, which I guess in turn does affect strength. You may notice that the blade is somewhat buried inside this sacrificial fence. This is just a scrap of MDF that's clamped to the table saw fence. This allows me to sneak up on the perfect cut. I don't have to worry about hitting my fence or anything like that. I can make a very shallow pass and then move the fence over a little bit, sneak up on the exact width that I need on a second pass. Edge of the short piece that'll go into the dado, and a couple of brads will hold that in position so that I don't need to clamp it down while everything is drying. There's so much glue surface here that it is a really strong joint. If you really wanted to, you could add some glue to this shoulder, though honestly I think the squeeze out's probably going to be enough. These clamps are here just to hold it, particularly for doing stuff on camera. It can be a little bit tricky to not get in the way of the workpiece camera, so clamps are very helpful for acting as a third hand. This is one of the things I really love about this design, the L leg design for shop furniture, is that it's rock solid. This is half of the table. And it stands up all by itself. If you made it out of a square leg, it would likely fall over, but the L shape really is super stable. Next up is installing the drawer slides on the rails that I've just screwed in. If you've not installed drawer slides before, they can be a little bit intimidating, but the good news is they're fairly simple to install, and even though you'll likely be using a different brand than I am, they're all pretty much universal in terms of the actual installation process, particularly for side mount drawer slides. First up is separating out the drawer side of the slide and the cabinet side of the slide. On almost all of them there'll be a little bit of a tab extended out. Here's the little tab here. Push the tab down or up and pull out. This is the drawer side of it, so we'll just put that to aside for now. So this is the rail I've screwed on. I've drawn a center line all the way down it. Taking the cabinet side of the slide, I can line up the holes where the screws will go with that center line. I'm also going to back the drawer slide so it's almost flush with the front of the cabinet. That's about where I want it to end up from the Outfeed table. For now, I need to clamp this into position so that I can drive some screws in to hold it up. I'll be using the elongated holes for the first couple of screws to get my alignment right. So I need to just be in a ballpark for this front edge, then I'll really dial it in. Now, because this is a sliding mechanism, we need a screw that doesn't have a particularly large head. Otherwise, it may not actually slide and your drill slide will be stuck open or stuck closed. The correct type to use is a Euro screw, but generally I wouldn't recommend them just for this type of thing. They need much more precision drilled holes than what I'm at least going to achieve on something like this. A countersunk or flathead screw may or may not fit. It depends on the size of the screw. I find that the number 8 gauge screws don't always clear it on all brands. On this one it's okay, but I find on these truss head screws they're a much better fit and they work on all brands that I've tried, so that's what I'd recommend going for. So I haven't driven the screws all the way in because that gives me a little bit of play going back and forth because it's the slotted hole that it went through. That way I can line up this front edge with where I want it. Drive home the screw, make sure we're all in alignment. Then I can put in a couple of extra screws to hold it in position to really lock it down. Because I have a contractor style saw, the motor on it sticks out the back, which means this is about as close as I can get the outfeed table to the saw, because otherwise it's going to hit the motor and I don't really want that. On the, I guess, front end is what we'll call this, the outfeed table will need to extend across like that on the top. Unfortunately, the supplier I bought the plywood from only had 12mm form ply in stock and they're not getting any more in. So I had to compromise and get a 12mm sheet instead of the 18mm. So I'll be using 2 layers of it and then the whole thing will get some edge banding. So that it'll come up just slightly below the top of the table and then I can use the levelers to raise it up so that's just a hair below. I'm really happy with how this has turned out. It's great to get so many jigs all in one spot, and crosscut slate in particular has never had a great home, so it's nice to have that there. If I make a bigger slate, it may not fit, but I can always go the other way around. There's nothing on the other side that'll actually stop that from happening. You may notice that there is no edge banding on the long edges. I'm in the middle of building a dining table that will have a lot of long offcuts, so I'm waiting for that to get to the part where I actually have that long offcut to glue on. This is the first time that I've worked with this lighter coloured plywood, which is Falcata plywood. It's a lightweight plywood meant for caravan fit outs. It's very, very light. I quite like using the stuff. It is a little bit on the soft side, so I don't know if I'll use it again, but it's an interesting material that I'll at least have a think about now that I've used it once. As I said in the introduction, there is a 3D model of this and the max cut file that I used for this. Probably won't be any use to anybody, but they're free if you want to have a look to see sort of the process that I went through. Thanks for watching.